Alrighty, welcome. Excuse me. Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about an absolute splattering up in Ann Arbor, Texas, getting that 131-12 against Michigan, and just a huge win for that program, and especially for Quinn Ewers, who might have just put himself into the first round of the NFL draft. But let's get to another splattering. Tennessee just went to work on NC State in this game, and it wasn't necessarily ugly from the get-go, which is kind of the funny thing about this game. It was one of those games that took a second to open up, but when it did, Tennessee took full advantage. It was absolute domination for much of this game, and Tennessee is for real. That is the biggest thing that everyone has to take away from this, because this was not a game that went the way that Tennessee thought it was going to go. If that was going to be the score, that was not going to be the box score that they were expecting. I can almost promise you that. So a really, really impressive game from them. I mean, they won this game by doing two things. They ran the ball really efficiently, and they played just suffocating defense against an offense that is going to give a lot of people problems. Now, maybe not the elite level SEC defenses problems, but they're going to give a lot of people in the ACC problems, and Tennessee made it look relatively easy to dominate this game. And the big time switch in this game, obviously, was that big time pick by, I'm blanking on his name, and I hate it because he's a walk-on. He deserves a scholarship. I'll leave it at that for the time being. But a remarkable play by him. NC State was down 3-10 at this moment, and they were driving down the field. I believe they were on the 15 or so of Tennessee. And then Grayson McCall misses Justin Jolie. They go the other way for a pick six, and this game just ends, essentially. This game just totally gets buried for NC State, and they didn't score an offensive touchdown in this game. It was really, really ugly. And overall, I think when you're Tennessee, the plain and simple of it is if I told you Nico Iamaleava was going to walk out there and throw two picks and just over 200 yards, you probably would have been a little bit worried about Tennessee even covering this spread. Well, they quadrupled the spread, so it was more than fine with Nico not necessarily playing his cleanest of football. They were still able to get a big-time win, and let's get into how they got this win, because it was really, really impressive to watch this team go to work, and the biggest thing was the line of scrimmage dominated this game. They had 249 rushing yards, 5.7 yards per carry for Tennessee. For NC State, 39 rushing yards and 1.4 yards per carry. I talked about it last week that Jordan Waters had to be a big factor in this game. He was not. Was very, very few heard from. So at the end of the day, this defensive line for Tennessee is so athletic, so deep. It's one of those teams that you just can't wait for a matchup like Bama or a matchup like Georgia, although Bama's offensive line has some troubles that we'll get into here in a second. But at the end of the day, this is a team that you cannot wait to see go up against Georgia in that offensive line, because they're so deep, they're so athletic on that D-line. It's going to be one of the best matchups of the entire year, regardless of the game. So this is one of those things that it was clear as day which team was more physical, which team was more dominant, bigger, stronger, faster, all of that stuff. It went Tennessee's direction. Really just dominating performances, particularly from those line of scrimmage players. And then they kept the wide receivers out of it. I talked about it last week. This was the only place that NC State had a decided advantage, at least in my mind. And it didn't look like that on Saturday. I mean, you have Concepcion, you have Noah Rogers, you have Justin Jolie. There should be places where you can take advantage of an inexperienced back end. They were not able to. Grayson McCall, 15 for 22, 104 yards, one pick, 4.7 yards per pass. Not going to be nearly good enough. And Kevin Concepcion took up over half of those passing yards with 53, and he was the leading receiver. So it was ugly. No two ways about that. And they did a great job keeping Concepcion under wraps, because that was the only way they were going to win this game, is get the ball out on the edge to these really athletic wide receivers and see if they can make a couple of plays out in space. They were not able to. Huge shout out to Boo Carter, who I thought played a really good game against some really, really tough circumstances, especially early on. Made some minor mistakes, but overall just played really, really good football, and just really impressed with that back end in general that I think still has some troubles, and I think still can get taken advantage of by the Georgias and some of the other teams around the SEC. But at the end of the day, a really, really good performance against a team that could have exploited your back end and was not able to. And then finally, the offensive game plan was just as clear as day. They had 44 carries, almost 250 yards on the ground, and it was one of those things where NC State did everything they could to stop that pass game, and they did a relatively good job. You know, two picks from Nico, only 200 yards passing. That's about as good as you're going to get, frankly, from this Tennessee offense. But at the end of the day, they're going to be able to run the ball. They have a really good offensive line. Dylan Sampson's an absolute monster. I believe he went for over 100 yards. I don't have it right here, but he went for over 100 yards. Nico added a little bit on the ground, 60 yards rushing and a touchdown there. So they did enough. It wasn't about, beating NC State over the head with a ton of deep passes. It wasn't about, putting on a highlight reel show and getting Nico Iamaleava into the Heisman conversation. It was about winning this game, and man, did they. They absolutely dominated from start to finish, and a lot of it was just them saying, okay, you're going to drop 8 in coverage, which they did a ton in this game. We'll just run the ball at you, and we'll run it for 44 carries, almost 250 yards, and you guys will not have any chance to be able to win this one. I believe the difference in plays called in this game was something like Tennessee around 50 to NC State around 25. So NC State's one of those teams, they run the ball very, very slowly down the field. They kind of are a little bit monotonous at times. And I think that's the thing. If you can get up on NC State early, if you can put pressure on them early and make Grayson McCall be the guy that's going to make the plays down the stretch, you're in a good position. Because at the end of the day, NC State runs very slowly. They want to get the run game going. They're not a team that is going to be able to beat you over the top at least all that often. So at the end of the day, that's the formula. Get out ahead of NC State really quickly, force the ball into Grayson McCall's hands, and then just let your guys on the back end feast. It's a very, very simple formula, but where they go from here, I think for NC State, this one really hurts, no doubt about it. I mean, you got beat down for 4 quarters in a game that, coming in, there were a lot of NC State fans that were looking at this as a turning point for the program, as a chance for them to beat a big-time SEC team and become a team that everyone's talking about for the playoff. That's obviously not how it went down, but at the end of the day, they still have a chance to do everything they want to do in this season. There's still plenty to fix. That O-line needs to get a ton better because they have Clemson in a couple of weeks and also an NIU team that we'll talk about here in a bit. But at the end of the day, this team needs to find a run game. They need to find an O-line that's going to be consistent at the point of attack. And then the defense, I think, is going to be mostly fine, although that defensive line not necessarily playing the way that you want them to is worrisome. But at the end of the day, I think when you look at the game plan comparative to what NC State can do going forward against some teams, it's not going to be that type of game plan going forward. So I'm not super worried about the defense. I do have my worries, don't get me wrong, but I do think they're going to be able to be much better than they were in this game, and I think Tennessee is just one of those offenses that you can do your best to stop them. You're not going to do a very good job. I can almost promise you that. But on the Tennessee side, it's all systems go. It's the same thing with Texas in a lot of ways, where this team rocks. It's really hard to find a hole in this team, at least a big-time hole. Now, you can poke little holes here and there, and I think UGA might just be able to take advantage of those really small holes. But at the end of the day, they're a different team this year than they ever have been under Josh Heupel. This is a better team than there was in 2022. I think they have a better quarterback. They have a way better defense. The wide receivers, I think, are more talented and deeper than they were, although I don't know if there's a Jalen Hyatt on this team, but I do think there are plenty of really talented players that spread the ball out more often and make it even tougher on that side. And then on the defense, James Pierce Jr., Arian Carter, Bryson Eason, these guys are just so dominant on that front seven that this back end that is inexperienced, that is young, that is still kind of learning the ropes, they have plenty of time and plenty of ability to make those plays, because if James Pierce Jr. is in your face, you're not going to make all that accurate of a throw. So at the end of the day, these two things work in tandem, and when your front seven is as good as Tennessee's front seven is, the back end's going to look a lot better than maybe it would if that front seven wasn't quite as dominant. So it's one of those things that you look at this game, there were so many different ways that I could convince you that Tennessee did not play well in this game. Whether it was, if I show you Nico's stat line, you would not think that Tennessee maybe even won this game, but at the very least did not win it by 41. I can tell you that. When you look at that stat line, it was really, really impressive that they were able to win, because at the end of the day, this is not what Tennessee has been. Now, don't get me wrong, Josh Heupel absolutely runs the ball, and that is the crux of his offense, as it is with a lot of elite play callers out there. But at the end of the day, it was remarkable to watch this team go to work, because it wasn't about the deep passes. It wasn't about Nico. It wasn't about anyone but Dylan Sampson in that front seven. And then on the other side, that offensive line just dominating the point of attack and really just imposing their will. Now, they got plenty coming up. Now, it is manageable, the schedule they have. They go to Oklahoma in a couple of weeks, another team we'll talk about later. Alabama at home, at UGA. They have plenty of games that are going to be a little bit worrisome, but let's say they go 1-2 in those games. Let's say they lose to Alabama and UGA, although I think that Alabama game they might be favored in, but let's just say they lose those 2 games and beat Oklahoma. They're into the playoff. There's no doubt about that. This is a really good team, and it's one of those teams that has that win that you need in that playoff room. Now they can say, well, they beat NC State away from home and were able to beat them in dominating fashion. That's going to mean something when it comes around to Selection Saturday. Or Selection Sunday. I can promise you that. There's going to be so many people talking about this game for quite some time to come, especially if NC State can put together a great performance the rest of the year. So overall, Tennessee, you're off running. CFP is very, very much in conversation for this team, and they are going to be as dangerous as they come in the SEC going forward. And then you just got to hope that NC State holds up their end of the bargain and doesn't just fall off a cliff after this one and loses all of the credibility of that win. But we'll obviously figure that out as the time goes on. But let's take our second break here, and when we come back, we're going to do a little bit of a twofer for you guys. We'll get to Nebraska just dominating Colorado for much of that game, and then Iowa State winning in comeback fashion. Kind of 2 very different games, honestly, but let's cover them right after this, so stick with us.